Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. That evening, Clive arrived in his car and told us we'd go sailing tomorrow. A pronouncement that brought squeals of delight from the girls. This sounded like fun, I thought. They were clearly looking forward to a day out in the boat, and so was I. The following day, we all piled into the station wagon with Clive at the wheel. Grace had had an attack of lumbago and above all wanted some peace and quiet, a rest from her big, boisterous family, as well as hangers-on like me. She'd planned a day's well-earned rest on the sofa, with her feet up, a cup of tea and a book. The Friday yacht was a Firefly, a two-sail wooden sailing dinghy called Seagull, built from a kit by Clive in a shed at Grand Clive, and kept at the yacht club on the River Ald. An unprepossessing sight, the river was as murky brown as the sea it flowed into, and had slimy-looking, muddy, black banks on both sides. Clive barked orders at us girls. Matthew hated sailing and had elected to make his own plans for the day. We had to run to and from the car, bringing bits and pieces of equipment, as well as dragging sails and life jackets from the storage locker at the club. Finally, after what felt like hours of preparation, we set off. The morning had been grey and chilly, and while we'd scurried around, getting ready, the sky had darkened ominously and it had begun to rain again. The wind had also begun to stiffen from a strong breeze to a rather gusty gale, and the boat shot off into the middle of the river with Clive at the helm, yelling at us to pull this sheet and that one there. I felt a bit like I had when I'd first attempted to play hockey at school under Mort's ferocious tuition, and quiet, gentle Clive had now turned into Captain Bligh. I tried to keep low and in the middle of the small craft, out of the way as much as possible, while the others scrambled about, sometimes trampling over me in their haste to obey his orders. We were all wearing bulky old life jackets, which made us cumbersome and hampered our agility. The wind was relentless and swept us rapidly upriver as Clive battled with the tiller, trying to anticipate and work with the unexpected and sudden gusts it kept battering the little boat with. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The dinghy yawed wildly, turned sideways onto the gale, and we went over. We had capsized right opposite the main outlet of the town sewer. In 1968, it was still acceptable for small towns to spill their waste into the river mouths, where it would be swept out to sea. The stink was indescribable, and we screamed and clung frantically to the bottom of the hull of our little upside-down craft in desperation. The outgoing tide and flow of the river formed a strong current that was pulling us rapidly downstream and out to sea. Clive continued to shout instructions at us, but we could barely hear him over the noise of the wind, and I didn't understand what he wanted us to do anyway. Finally, more by luck than skill, we were swept near enough to the bank on the yacht club's side and were able to gain some footing in the slippery black ooze that formed the river bottom. We scrambled up the bank, oblivious of the knee-deep stinking mud we had to wade through, just glad to be back on dry land after that experience, while Clive stayed gamely with the capsized boat, standing waist-deep in the glutinous mud and water after pushing it so it stuck fast in the shallows. "Run to the club and get help," he shouted to Helen and Blair, and they trudged off to do just that. I followed in their wake with Liz. Fortunately, we'd landed on the bank nearer the club rather than the opposite one with the sewage outlet, which looked utterly desolate and had no signs of habitation anywhere. After summoning help for Clive in the boat, Helen rang her mother to tell her what had happened and to ask to be fetched, as we hadn't brought a change of clothes and were freezing cold, covered from head to foot in mud that reeked of sewage, and in my case, utterly fed up. Not as fed up as Grace apparently was when she arrived a good hour later. We'd successfully ruined her entire day, and she now had to take 4 sullen, stinking girls home in the family saloon, leaving Clive to sort out all the problems with the recovery of the boat. I was particularly dismayed as my new pair of tackies had been sucked off my feet as I'd waded through the revolting black mud and were lost forever. I had the temerity to bemoan the fate of my new tackies from the back seat of the car and was given short shrift by my aunt. "Well, if that's the worst thing that happened to you," she snapped, and I shut up. The weather remained sullen and overcast. The beach had no appeal for me whatsoever, and I definitely didn't relish the idea of another sail in Seagull, which had been recovered with the yacht club's help and was now standing back on the dock. Clive, having hosed off the worst of the mud and made a supreme effort to get it ready to go back on the river, was looking around for crew members again, and I thought the girls seemed keen. And, though the girls seemed keen enough to go with him, I wasn't. I now realized why Matthew had so adamantly refused to go sailing. Grace played golf almost every day, and sometimes she wanted caddies, which involved trailing after her around the often boggy course in usually vile weather, dragging her heavy bag of clubs for 18 holes. That didn't sound too inviting to me. The golf course was also a haunt of Sir Benjamin Britten, Baron Britten of Aldeburgh, the town's most famous resident and leading British composer of the mid-20th century. He was also an outstanding pianist and conductor. Grace said she often saw him striding over the fairways, waving an imaginary conductor's baton about, as he composed another soon-to-be famous piece. It was time for me to leave, and a friend of the Priday family, who had come down to Aldeburgh from London to stay for a couple of days, was kind enough to take me back to my Barnby cousins in London to save me travelling there alone by train, where I could have ended up anywhere. He took me through Billingsgate as a treat, because it was so early. We'd made a dawn start, as he had to be in his office in London by 9 o'clock that morning. The fish market was in full swing, and I heard the cries of auctioneers as they stood next to tray after tray of whole, fresh fish packed in ice. I was excited and full of questions as I stared at this extraordinary sight. We also went via the Smithfield meat market, and again there was a flurry of activity as men shouted to one another as they carried half carcasses of various animals over their blood-spattered shoulders. They wore white coats and tiny white hats as they slung the skinned beasts onto steel hooks in the backs of vans to be carted off to the many butchers around the London area. Finally, we arrived back at the Barnbys' flat to be warmly greeted by my Aunt Audrey again. "We had a telegram from your mum while you were away," said Audrey. "She wants you to ring your great-aunt Mary in Kent. She's invited you to stay. Here's the number." My heart sank. The very last thing I wanted to do was go off to stay with some strange old lady. My maternal grand sister and the youngest daughter of Omar, my great-grandmother, who'd been a spy for the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War. This great-aunt lived in a remote country home somewhere in Kent. Again, I caught a train, this time all alone. I was on my way to a tiny village called Tonbridge in Kent. I sat on my second-class seat and pondered about spending 2 weeks with an old lady I'd never even met. Mum had always made a big song and dance about her well-bred and well-connected aunt, who now lived in a stately home in a highly acceptable English county. She'd been married to Lord Byng and had had 2 sons by him before he died, and she married again to another titled Duke, whose name escapes me now. Now she lived with her second husband and his 2 grown-up daughters in her huge house, presumably inherited from her first marriage to Lord Byng. I'd already met both middle-aged daughters 2 years before, when they'd come to our cattle farm, New Forest, for a week's visit to see Mum. She knew them from time spent with her aunt on my parents' regular trips overseas. When they went skiing every year, they'd always fit in a visit to London to do some shopping and stay with various relatives on both sides of the family, just as I was doing now. I'd been 16 when the two sisters had visited and found them both very odd, rather masculine. They reminded me a bit of old Mort, my school gym mistress. They'd expressed a great interest in horses, and happy to oblige, I'd supplied them with Prince and Ronald, the only two polo ponies that Dad had retained as pensioners after selling off his other four. With me on Rocket, I'd taken these two really strange women out every day on all my own favourite rides. They hunted, they said, and both of them kept their thoroughbreds stabled at Great Aunt Mary's country home in Kent. Although the rides had been pleasant enough, even after a whole week in their company, I still found them both very odd in a way I couldn't really describe, and didn't feel too comfortable spending so much time with them. It was all too reminiscent of being with Mort. One of them was waiting at the tiny station in the very pretty market town of Tunbridge to collect me in her small car, and we drove a few miles through the most classically enchanting and what I thought of as the most typically English countryside I'd seen yet. What I called chocolate box England, with thatched cottages and hollyhocks in their neat little gardens. Roses grew profusely on trellises around their small wooden front doors. Something really you'd find in a fairy tale. We pulled in through enormous, ornate, wrought iron gates and continued down a long gravel drive to stop outside the front door of a vast and beautiful stately home. It was something like out of a Jane Austen novel, resembling the homes where the rich young aristocratic men lived. The house overlooked perfectly manicured parkland with smaller meadows and hedgerows beyond. It was like Stowe, but on a substantially smaller, simpler scale. Aunt Mary was a sweet, wispy, frail old woman who greeted me kindly and asked her stepdaughter to show me to an enormous bedroom on the first floor, which overlooked the front grounds, giving me a panoramic view of them and the countryside beyond. It certainly was a beautiful place, and I was rather looking forward to spending time here. I went down for afternoon tea and met a rather revolting and melancholy old husband, the father of the weird stepdaughters. He had some kind of digestive problem and spent most of his time in the lavatory, which was uncomfortably close. It was situated right next to their drawing room, and he kept appearing sporadically out of there after much noisy flushing to ply me with port and stale water biscuits. Grand sister, my great Aunt Mary, the youngest of four girls, had been spectacularly beautiful in her youth, so lovely that she had even attracted the attention of the then Prince of Wales before he was crowned King Edward VIII, who had been so taken with her on a royal visit to South Africa, he'd asked her out. Now she was a new age vegetarian health nut, long before it became fashionable, and throughout my long 2 weeks there, our diet consisted of half-cooked broccoli and tepid, lumpy seaweed soup eaten out of her rough, homemade pottery bowls. These produced a horrible gritty sand when I dragged my spoon across the bottom, ravenously hungry and scraping futilely for some nourishment. The biscuits sounded tempting until I bit into one and discovered they had the same consistency and taste of bread that has fallen to the nursery floor and been forgotten for several weeks. The port took the edge off my misery, but meant I had to spend more time with the old lecher while he became flushed and loquacious, and I had to dodge about, evading his clammy embrace. That should be enough for this week. More about the old aunt and England after this. And eventually I go to Ireland with both my Barmby cousins, and I wonder if you want to hear about that. Quite exciting and delightful trip for 3 weeks. Just let me know. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back again next week with some more of this, and goodbye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.